The immigration crisis. Most of what you see and hear and read elsewhere is the consequence of failed policy. Here, we'll talk about what caused this crisis, and are we about to make the same mistakes in the Middle East? I'm Holland Cooke in Washington. This is The Big Picture on RT America. The Washington noise machine is turned up to 11 about the immigration crisis on our southern border, and the mainstream media are taking the bait. While hollering about how to fix immigration dominates coverage, nobody seems to want to talk about why immigrants are overwhelming the system. All our lives, people my age, baby boomers, have seen TV news coverage of riots around the world where people were chanting, "Yankee, go home." How culpable is Uncle Sam? Let's ask Dan Kovalik, professor of international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He is the author of, among other books, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, How the U.S. is Orchestrating a Coup for Oil, and New York radio and TV commentator and RT contributor Steve Malzberg. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you, Alan.
Undaunted by various failed attempts to topple Venezuela's elected president, the USA continues to back what would be a puppet regime headed by opposition leader Juan Guaido. The United States reportedly engineered an electrical blackout, among other regime change mischief. And now the Trump administration wants to redirect over $40 million in aid, previously earmarked to Guatemala and Honduras. Troubled countries, those overwhelming our southern border, are fleeing. Dan, let's go to confession. Where else south of the border have we meddled over the years?
Well, first of all, let's just talk about Guatemala and Honduras very quickly. The U.S. in 2009 supported a military coup in Honduras, which toppled a democratically elected government and installed a very repressive government that is still in power to this day. By the way, Hillary Clinton, in her book Hard Choices, in the hardcover version, admitted that she helped orchestrate the coup to make sure that the democratically elected president did not return. She then excised that from the softcover version of her book. In Guatemala, we've been meddling since the 1950s. We overthrew a democratically elected government there in 1954 and installed a series of military dictatorships that killed over 200,000 people, which is now recognized as a genocide. This mostly targeted Mayan Indians. But in addition, in El Salvador, beginning in the early 80s, actually in the late 70s, the U.S. also supported death squads and a military dictatorship that killed about 75,000 people, including Catholic priests, including Archbishop Oscar Romero, who the Catholic Church just designated as a saint. In those three countries in particular, you see huge migration to the United States, and that is directly linked to the U.S. activities that I just described.
Well, Steve, how bad would it be if we simply listened to what Pat Buchanan was preaching out when he ran for president? Mind our own business, stay home, and fix what's here. How bad would that be?
Well, maybe he could have selected Peter, Paul, and Mary as to run the the State Department, and one of them could have been Secretary of State. Thank God they are not. Look, it's all well and good to say let's mind our own business, and Donald Trump basically ran on that.
Sure.
And I admired that philosophy. I have a son who's 20 years old. I don't want him to go fight somewhere where it doesn't mean anything, where there's nothing to be gained. But there you run up against circumstances where you have to intervene. You have to intervene for the well-being of the United States and to defend an ally. And when that happens, the philosophy of just let it happen and ignore it is not feasible.
All right, issue 2, Flashpoint, Saudi Arabia. Last month, we learned that 1,000 more American troops were headed to the Middle East. Now we know where half of them are going, to the Prince Sultan Air Base near Riyadh. There's a big buildup underway at the airstrip, reportedly to accommodate advanced U.S. fighter jets and Patriot missiles. Just last month, senators from both sides of the aisle sought to block arms sales to the Saudis. Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat, warned that the process we are setting in motion will allow Congress to weigh in on the totality of our security relationship with Saudi Arabia, not just one arms sale, and restore Congress's role in policymaking. Even staunch Trump ally Lindsey Graham condemned that deal, which the president made anyway under an emergency declaration that end-runs congressional approval. Defense contractor Raytheon will work directly with the Saudis on the kind of precision-guided weapons tech that has been killing civilians in war-torn Yemen, where the USA supports Saudi Arabia against Iran-backed rebels. The UN calls what's happening there the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Dan, what's wrong with this picture?
Well, there's a lot wrong with it. Let's start with the fact that Saudi Arabia, as Donald Trump pointed out when he was running for president, as Joe Biden also pointed out some time ago, Saudi Arabia is the biggest supporter of terrorist groups in the world, including Al-Qaeda and ISIS. According to the 9/11 Commission, Saudi Arabia had a significant role in the 9/11 attacks. And here we are supporting that country militarily. Meanwhile, as you note, Saudi Arabia, with U.S. and U.K. help, is now devastating the country of Yemen. According to the UN, 10 million Yemenis will die by the end of this year due to that war. And it can be only described as a genocidal war. And yet we continue to support Saudi Arabia despite this, and despite the fact, frankly, that it's a monarchy and a brutal dictatorship, even though the U.S. claims to defend democracy throughout the world. It's just an incredible situation, and frankly, an embarrassing one for the United States.
Well, we just showed President Trump all smiles next to Mohammed bin Salman. Steve, after the grisly death and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi and still unresolved questions about the Saudis' involvement in 9/11, are you a little uncomfortable that President Trump is so buddy-buddy with MBS?
No, what I find disgraceful is that the gentleman answered the whole question and never once mentioned Iran. If there was no Iran, if Iran wasn't fighting in Yemen with their proxies launching missiles into Saudi Arabia from Yemen, if Iran wasn't, by the way, the biggest supporter of terrorism, Hezbollah and every other terrorist group you could imagine, it's Iran that is forcing our hand to ally with Saudi Arabia against Iran. Iran, who threatens to annihilate Israel, who threatens to annihilate us, who has ballistic missiles that are capable of causing great damage. How could you give that whole answer analyzing Yemen and the region and Saudi Arabia and our relationship and not once mention Iran?
All right, well, let's go there. MBS has already articulated hostile intentions against Iran, which is a word John Bolton and Mike Pompeo keep whispering in the president's ear. With oil tankers being seized, some disappeared, drone shoot-downs, and everything else that's roiling in the Gulf every single day. Dan, are we this close to a war with Iran that would dwarf the Iraq fiasco?
Well, we may be, you know, and that is quite frightening. Is retired Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who helped lie us into the war in Iraq, by the way, he admitted to that, and who now says he doesn't want another war in Iran. He estimated that a war with Iran would be 10 times more costly in terms of lives and treasure than the war in Iraq. So you're talking millions dead, trillions spent. But meanwhile, I want to take issue with what my colleague said about Iran. Iran is not a threat. In fact, while Saudi Arabia played a role in supporting the 9/11 attacks, Iran supported the U.S. after 9/11 in fighting the Taliban, in fighting Al-Qaeda.
We're not in 9/11 anymore. We're here.
I'm sorry.
We're here today.
Iran is actually, wait, hey, you'll get your chance.
Oh, really? Thank you.
Iran is a mortal enemy of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Saudi Arabia is their friend. So we are supporting Saudi Arabia even though they support the terrorist groups that attacked us on 9/11. It's incredible. Iran is not a threat. And it's interesting that, you know, we're worried about whether Iran's going to develop nuclear weapons. Right now they have none. Israel has between 100 and 200.
Good.
The U.S. has thousands.
Good.
You know, so Iran is
Those
not
are the good
a threat
guys. Iran
to
are the bad
United
guys.
States.
Hey, let's, before we applaud weapons of mass destruction, let's get back to the wide-angle shot. Amongst 20-some Democratic presidential candidates, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, an Army major twice deployed in the Middle East, rails against what she calls interventionist wars of regime change that have cost our nation trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, simultaneously creating more devastation, human suffering, and refugees in the countries where the U.S. regime change war is waged. Now, lots of our misadventures abroad had one thing in common: oil. Steve, with the United States now energy self-sufficient, and as we become a net energy exporter, is there hope for fewer shenanigans abroad?
I don't believe that we ever went to war to enhance the profits of oil companies or anything like that. And I don't think we're going to do it in the future. And I think that if we still do go and have to confront Iran, and I hope we don't, it'll put an end to this nonsense that we did the previous wars for oil. Because as you said, we're basically self-sufficient. But I just want to say I was applauding because Israel and us, we're the good guys. Iran, they're the bad guys. So to say, well, we have nuclear weapons in Israel, so why shouldn't they, is ludicrous.
Dan, I got 30 seconds. Land the plane.
Yes. Well, I believe that, in fact, these wars have been about not access to oil, because Steve's right, we don't need oil. It's about control and about who profits from them, and that's what these wars are about. The U.S. wants their companies to profit from Iranian and Venezuelan oil and not the Venezuelan and Iranian people. That's what these wars are about, and that's why we need to oppose them.
Dan Kovalik and Steve Malzberg, thank you for joining us here on The Big Picture.
I'm Larry King. Questioning, listening, learning. You know, I've always said I never learned anything when I was talking. It's important to listen. Question more.